Hey, thank you all very, very much. This is a set of ongoing work. It's not definitive, hence the emerging. So I'm really excited to work with y'all and push the edge forward as we try and understand causal heterogeneity and heterogeneity in general. So let's get right into it. This talk is going to have 4 sections. The first section, I'm going to present a general dilemma, which y'all are going to be familiar with. I'm going to deliberately avoid going deep into statistics underlying causal forests or discussing, potential outcomes or Rubin's model in depth. The handout and, in-person conversation will be better for that. And I'm going to discuss a couple of different applications. It says an application, but it's actually 2 sections. The first is an extension of my dissertation work. Second is something I'm currently working on and is thus less baked. And I'm happy to go into something that I'm thinking about in a workshop, which is using data from the Titanic disaster to provide an example for how other people can apply these techniques. Now, briefly circle back in discussion. So the standard structure of a paper is you are a prophet describing a past dilemma in the literature that informs a research question, which you analyze, bringing to your prostrate audience and refining the state of the world and theory. I think that all of us are more or less dubious about how this actually works for a variety of different reasons. More importantly than our own well-deserved skepticism, which we use to generate the ideas that create the research in the first place, other people are skeptical, and those skeptical people dictate things that we often don't like requirements for sharing data that we want to keep so that we can do more analyses before it hits the outside world, or requirements for more and more complex hoops to jump through. The dilemma here is that between our own skepticism and that generates the research ideas we want to explore in the world and the external constraints placed upon us as we do research, we invite scrutiny within and without when we have an issue where we don't know what causes an effect, or we suspect there's heterogeneity, but being on the frontier of the research, the theory doesn't predict heterogeneity accurately or at all. It says we might expect that different people experience the socioeconomic class differently when encountering this health outcome. Well, that doesn't really help you in your analyses. Are you going to test every covariate interaction with socioeconomic status? Well, then you're going to be doing classic multiple test problem where you're going to interact 40 things with socioeconomic status. Well, what if it's very likely socioeconomic status and gender are the interaction of interest? Well, it's like 2 things interacted with 39 things. It's going to be an issue. You're going to have multiple comparison correction, or you're going to really want to do a Bonferroni on that, because then you'll detect nothing. Bringing us back to a broader lens of this fundamental problem of causal inference. We want to have our cake and eat it too. We don't observe the outcomes, and this leads to a problem where we're unable to do a proper design. The goal is to move towards conditional average treatment effects. If we can properly estimate conditional average treatment effects, we don't have to go through a garden of forking paths to anticipate which units are going to experience a treatment or an event differently than other units. And this, as you've established before, the difference between average treatment effect and the conditioned average treatment effect is that we have covariates and they condition. But this movement from the average treatment effect to the conditional average treatment effect invites 2 problems. The Guardian forking paths problem I previously mentioned, and prior slides problem of we're just not quite sure how to get there. So what I'm suggesting in this talk is that causal forests are a way to get there that's emerging and evolving. But it's not just the only way. So this talk is focused on causal forests. There are other methods, which I'll describe next. So here's a large table. There's a lot of things on this table that I'm not going to go deeply into. But I just want to provide you a map of different ways to explore the question of conditional average treatment effects. Regression interactions are the standard method, which I actually quite like, and I've used them before in published work. You manually specify exactly what you're looking for, and you get an easily interpretable result. I like that. The problem is you risk in two different directions what you're going to see. One is you don't know what you don't know, so you don't measure anything that you not anticipate. You can deal with this with the lasso approach by including everything, but you're unlikely to include everything in a lasso approach. And there's possibility of multicollinearity in the lasso approach, which can throw up problems. There's matching and stratification, there's K nearest neighbor, there's even Bayesian approaches. My argument is that causal forests are a good approach because they lack pre-specification. This lack of pre-specification makes them a good step zero approach once you suspect causal heterogeneity, to then deploy other approaches, a lasso based on all the terms the causal forest identified, for instance, or a meta-regression following a causal forest. Those are going to be ways that we can think about which methods to select to find conditional average treatment effects. So some pros and cons. I'm going to focus directly on causal forests as opposed to all the others. A pro is that it captures interactions. A con is that you need a binary treatment. You can have multi-arm treatments. That's an emerging area in causal forests, where you have multiple different treatments which can have overlap on the same unit. But it needs to be binary. It cannot be a condition. It cannot be a continuous variable, an interval variable, an ordinal variable. You need to dichotomize according to your theoretical insight before, if that's the case. Does this person have heart disease, yes or no? When of course that's not that simple. But you needed a condition on a binary treatment, though your outcome does not need to be binary. So, yeah.
I'm sorry, Justin. I think there was a question in the chat asking to clarify how you're using the word heterogeneity. I don't know if you can see more detail in the question in the chat, but it sounded like a foundational question that you might want to clarify before you move on.
Yeah, so Guang asks, could you clarify what heterogeneity is in your talk? Typically, heterogeneity is not an issue. The issue is unobserved heterogeneity. Well, that's what I'm talking about. When I say heterogeneity, I mean difference in effect. I'm talking about causal heterogeneity in this talk. There are general random forest approaches that talk about heterogeneity and outcome. That's not the direct focus of this talk. The issue is unobserved heterogeneity. Guang usefully brings up. I should have clarified. I'm interested in whether we can identify heterogeneity. And the question is, if we don't pre-specify with a lot of these different techniques, we're not going to observe it. No, it doesn't, because it's no.
There's a manual pointer that goes.
That's really okay. Yeah. Gesture over here. I can use my hands. Yeah, so the unobserved heterogeneity is the issue. And there's different ways to observe heterogeneity. The pre-specification is what I'm trying to gesture at, literally and metaphorically here, as the issue. So going directly into what an honest causal forest is. In the handout, I describe a residualization step. I'm not going to go into that in this talk because it's beyond the point of understanding the intuitive logic of an honest causal forest. But an honest causal forest is based on trees, classification and regression trees. The goal of a tree is based on a subsample of data to split across randomly selected covariates to maximize heterogeneity and treatment effect, where you pre-specify what your treatment is, what your outcome is, and what the covariates that are randomly considered at each split are. So each individual tree maximizes heterogeneity at each split until it exhausts the sample size or exhausts heterogeneity, as in it can't find within the random set of variables a split that has any significant difference in the predicted heterogeneity. To make this abstract example more tangible, I'll take some past research and go down. So, process said a more intuitive way. You start off with about half your data, all your data. You use that for the training of an individual tree, reserving the rest for the estimation on that same tree once it's assembled. At each split, starting off with the initial split, you consider a random subset of covariates. Eventually, once the tree is assembled, you use estimation data to predict for units defined by their X covariates. Visually, this is what this looks like. Units are shunted depending on whether they do or do not meet the criteria. So you can imagine this would be gender or age or any other Boolean law, like age is greater than or equal to 40. True, all units are shunted. False, all units are shunted. Doesn't have to be equal splits, by the way, though each split does need to preserve a minimum number of units in order to maintain predictive validity. That number is about 5, though it's a configurable hyperparameter of the trees. In reality, yeah.
So the maximizing heterogeneity, that's maximizing the heterogeneity and the causal effect. Is that
Yes.
kind of the same thing as like maximizing the variance explained by the cutoffs of the covariates?
That is almost identical. There's small difference in that the maximizer is trying to, it's the residualization that I said I won't go into, produces an unexplainable variation. The residualization step tries to predict the outcome according to a propensity and according to the covariates. And so the unexplainable variation due to a treatment is what's being maximized. So, but there are forests, a random forest would do exactly what you suggested because it doesn't have the residualization step in the same way that a causal forest does. So causal forest is first a regression forest, and it you get doubly robust, essentially, like you have a propensity for treatment and the propensity based solely on covariates, and then it gets complicated. But yes. Yeah. So you can imagine a target point for X covariates, which could encompass, 1 to whatever number of units that have this matrix of, not matrix, a vector of covariates. And they don't meet this criteria. They don't meet this criteria. They do meet this criteria. They end up in leaf 7. And that's when they have a prediction for this individual tree. So what actually happens? Well, depending on the sample and the hyperparameters, trees can become quite complex. Any individual tree is quite terrible because it is based on half the data and based on half the data used for training and half the data used for estimation. So there's a high variance between any individual tree. Tree 2 looks quite different than tree 1. Then you get to tree N. I like to use a lot of trees, like 10,000 of them, but basically you just use as many trees as is computationally feasible and justified because there's asymptotic. You're not going to get a lot going from 10,000 to 100,000 trees necessarily.
And are those varying on the basis of which data are in the testing versus establishing the model part, or which
more
variables
driven
you start
by-
with?
It's more driven by the variables
Okay.
in my experience, though it's driven by both.
Yeah.
So at each split point, there's a random subselection of the variables. This is dictated, how many variables are considered is dictated by a Poisson distribution centered on a variable called mtry. Mtry is the number of variables to try to split on at that split point. And the Poisson distribution, this takes an integer and selects from all the variables. You can actually, and by the way, you can split on the same variable multiple times if that variable is not binary, right? So this is an aside. One of the cool things about this is that you can realize differences on a continuous interval variable at multiple points. So let's say that people who like guns more than average are different than people who dislike guns more than average. But then people who really like guns are different than people who only like guns a little bit more than average. The tree can split at multiple points as long as it's not binary. So it's really nice when you have data that's continuous for these trees, is you can eke out a lot of heterogeneous effects from potential heterogeneity in the relationship between a continuous variable and treatment effect. But yeah, to directly answer your question, yes, it's driven by both the training and estimation random splits and the random splitting based on selection of different variables to consider. Going back a little bit from the details of tree generation and forest consideration to why are we doing this and what does this lead to? There are a couple of advantages for this approach. Pre-specify the variables to consider, but by doing that, we're being very, very generous. We're including essentially all variables in our approach. We're not pre-specifying the relationship of those variables to one another. If you expect multicollinearity or mechanical relationships, that's something to consider. Like you probably don't want to include a binary version of a variable and a continuous version of the same variable, but the tree will just prefer the continuous version mechanically because there's more splitting to consider, right? So it's not the end of the world even then. It's adaptive to high dimensional data. Recall earlier, I was talking about you can split multiple times the same variable, you can split different levels, and the training of each individual tree relying on different sets of data and different covariates means that each tree is independent of every other tree, which leads to a balanced approach to the bias variance trade-off that plagues all machine learning attempts. Now, what do you give up? Well, you give up some efficiency by using this so-called honest splitting. You give up a little bit of efficiency, so you need a larger N than if you were doing an OLS regression and anticipating the actual relationship between all these variables. Interpretation is more complex because at the end you have a forest, not an individual tree to interpret, because each individual tree is actually quite terrible and has high variance. You require binary treatments. I complained about that earlier. I think that's an area where it'd be really cool if we could get past that, but no, not right now. And which I think is actually a positive in some ways, requires domain knowledge to interpret. All right. Yeah.
I have a question. So when you were talking about how if you have like a continuous outcome and you can kind of like understand all these like fine distinctions.
So you can use covariate.
I mean, oh, a continuous covariate. Like, does it rely on like a kind of minimum number of samples in order to make those splits?
That's the problem of you need a large sample in order to explore, which intuitively makes sense. if you have only one unit, which had extremely high, I'm going to take this gun desirability and run with it throughout this talk, then you're not going to be able to explore the counterfactual. You're going to re-encounter the fundamental problem of causal inference because you're not going to be able to do different split points. But earlier, like let's say, I'm doing fine. Okay. Let's say gun desirability above versus below median was the first split point. And let's say this person, and let's say it was like gun desirability is below median, is the condition, the Boolean that we split on. False. Well, right here, everybody above median gun desirability is still here in this tree. I mean, obviously not everybody because this is an abstract tree, but when we're thinking about totality of the forest, we can imagine a tree that's created afterwards. Everyone with above median is here. We could then split again if that's the most relevant variable to maximize heterogeneity available at this random split point. That is exactly what I mean. Yeah, you can split multiple times until you exhaust the sample size. And I said it was 5, but that's a configurable parameter. So 5 units is going to eliminate the ability to have a leaf. If a leaf has less than 5 units, that leaf will not be created, and there will be a terminal node, which is what you saw. Come on. Yeah. You notice how these are unequal in depth? That's because units are running out once you go into deep enough a tree. It's encountering either or both of 2 things. No heterogeneity to discover in the remaining data and the remaining variables that are randomly selected, and or you have no more units to shunt left or right. Yeah, come on. Okay, yeah.
So sorry, one more conceptual question. If you tried every single variable at every single decision point, would you just get the same tree over and over again?
Yes, that is precisely the problem. The issue that would be like the ideal, and that's what we kind of want to connect afterwards. And I'll show you a current way that we're thinking about constructing called the policy tree, which is an abstract, shallow tree to maximize heterogeneity. But yes, the trees wouldn't be independent, and you would lose the bias variance trade-off. So I'm going to speed through this because I'm running a little short on time. I want to give you all more questions at the end, but I'm going to show you 2 examples from my own research. This is an old example. It was, I'll show you the focal variable here that's of interest is the ownership of guns between 2 prospective neighbors that participants were choosing between. So preference conditioned on gun ownership. This is what it looks like. You choose one of these 2. This is old stuff, so I'm just gonna sort of zoom through it. Come on. What I did was OLS regression on the average marginal component effect of ownership of guns. Everything that you'd expect from a randomized, nicely controlled experiment. All right. Yeah, I really need to zoom through this. I apologize. I'm happy to revisit this in questions, but I'm going to go at a fast clip in order to get to the causal aspects of this. What you can see, strong negative effect on people's desire to have a neighbor who owns a gun, particularly strong if that gun is an AR-15, much stronger than any other potential variable that people have studied in neighborhoods in the past. This persists even if you delimit the sample to people who are compliers, who are maximally attentive, versus people who are merely treated or have an intended treatment. Yeah. All right, now going into the forest. What does the forest look like that I constructed to analyze this? So it's actually pretty simple and quite readable. And I'd like to lead a workshop to show you how to do this at a different time when there's an opportunity to do that.
No problem.
This is like, I'm trying to, the intuitive logic is actually, I think, fairly clear for the causal force, but there's quite a bit of complexity that can be explained and deserves to be gone into, which I try and balance in the handout a little bit. But the actual description is fairly simple. You have a package called GRF, if you use it, which is, I think, the best package. You ask for it to make a causal forest. You have a treatment vector called W. You have an outcome vector called Y. And you have a set of X covariates. Now, this is really cool. When you do a random experiment, you know the treatment propensity, right? So you just tell it. That helps with the residualization step that I keep on saying I'm not going to talk about, but I keep on talking about a little bit. You tell it how many trees. It's defaulting to 2,000, but 10,000 is nice. And there are like 35,000 observations with this data set. So it took me about 30 minutes to run my computer. You can have cluster variables. Honesty should always be true under most conditions, though, or there can be arguments. You can tune parameters. The hyperparameters is a fancy way of saying what are the parameters of the forest generation that control how each tree is generated. And those are the things that, while you don't pre-specify the relationship with the covariates, you can and do pre-specify hyperparameters. But you can tune hyperparameters by running different miniature causal forests and comparing their out-of-box predicted performance to one another to find the hyperparameters that maximize the out-of-box predicted performance. Once you find those hyperparameters, you can use them and a seed for partitioning or predictability. And then you find an average treatment effect, which as an experiment should just basically be the same as your OLS random treatment effect or average treatment effect, right? This is how it all works. All right, this is for this old work, what it looks like. Okay. Average treatment effect. Okay, now it gets interesting. You create this forest. You have an average treatment effect. You have a density plot showing you what the conditional average treatment effects looks like. What do you do to actually analyze what's driving heterogeneity once you have this forest? The most simple way to do it is what's called a variable importance plot. This plot is a plot that shows which variables are split on the most with weighting towards higher splits. Higher splits are seen as more valuable because they affect a greater proportion of the units, right? As that great question asked earlier, like, okay, like what's the role of units and can you split multiple times? This is true. Higher splits affect more units, therefore are considered more important. And okay, I have another question. Wong asks, is a causal forest tree mainly a competitor of regression, addressing interactions more implicitly? If that's the case, why is it more causal than regression? I don't think it's a competitor to regression. I think regression is far superior to any given causal tree or causal forest, but it requires that you know which covariates and the interactions of the covariates and the power of the covariates. Like, is X squared? Is there an X cubed relationship? Well, if there's an X cubed times gender. Those are things that are not always obvious. If you know mechanistically the relationship, you should use OLS. If you don't know the relationship and you want to have potential to use your expertise to discover it, but you don't want to run every permutation possible because you're correctly worried that you don't know which will be true relationships versus will be false relationships, that's a good argument to run a bias variance trade-off optimized approach like machine learning that can indicate which covariates have the most power to predict heterogeneity, and therefore which might better inform a subsequent OLS regression. I hope that addresses Kwong's question. All right, so importance, where maximal importance is 1 and minimal importance is 0. Interpreting this is easy, but also hard. Desire is gun desirability. Ideology and party, as you might expect, will refer to politics. So the impact of a neighbor's AR-15 ownership on a desire to have him as a neighbor is driven largely, it appears, by your own desire for guns. Secondarily, you have a variety of low impact factors that are nevertheless theoretically significant. Now, you could have theorized, and you probably would have theorized all these different factors, but would you have known the degree of the impact? Would you have known how they cluster together? No, I don't think so. I was, and this is the literature that I'm most familiar with. Yeah,
So, but it's still conditions on the set of variables that I actually have for the trees, right?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
Like, it's still conditioned on the actual variables that I have that I couldn't put into the trees, right?
Yes, absolutely. That's the, I have no escape for the question of what if there are relationships that weren't captured in the data? If you have relationships that aren't captured in data, you can't use that data to capture them. I mean, I'm just gonna declare that. Seriously, but like, that's something that I can't do anything with. Yeah. It's a good point, though. You're never going to find the data generating process from data that wasn't generated by it.
Does it tell you though, since we're a model fit, like you're explaining X% of variance or something?
Yeah. Maybe I skipped that slide. I have a slide. Oh, it's next.
Oh, very good.
Yeah. Yong Sai asks, is it right to interpret this method as a useful tool to discover / explore potential causal effects? Yes. What, sort of, I mean, like, yes, but like, that question could be more specific and like, it might be no for some things. It depends on the results of the causal forest. Okay, come on. Oh, I clicked the wrong area. There we go. Okay, this is exactly your question. How do you diagnose the performance of your causal forest? It's actually quite simple. You say, calibration, begin parenthesis, causal forest, end parenthesis. And it says, oh, right here, mean forest prediction, which is basically what is the accuracy of the average treatment effect of the causal forest for units that were not used for the trees. So like, you know how earlier I was talking about the train versus test? That's used to throw in all out of box units and see how well they predict. So for this causal forest, I have a great prediction. 1, that's as good as it gets for the accuracy of my average treatment effect. I have a pretty good differential forest prediction. The important thing to realize here is that if the alpha values are good, that means that you have heterogeneity in your forest. And if it's near 1, that means that you can accurately predict the heterogeneity in your forest. So pretty near 1, so like you shouldn't, base extremely accurate. You shouldn't like, this is not perfect, but there is heterogeneity and it is usually correctly predicted. Okay. How am I doing on time? I'm not doing great. I don't think this is the most important thing, but I'm just going to show you what a shallow policy tree could look like, which is another cool way to analyze. Maybe I'll go into it. Yeah. So if I create a policy tree, which is another cool package you can use, it shunts doubly robust predictions generated from the causal forest through the causal forest to generate an ideal tree, which is very, very shallow, but it's extremely computationally complex to generate that ideal tree. So what this ideal tree says is that the initial split should be age. Once you split on age, then gun desirability, which is scaled by the way from 0 to 100, and is an average of 3 different desirabilities for a pistol, a hunting rifle, and an AR-15. Then gun desirability for both happens to be the most important Boolean split point. But it chooses different split points. This is the interesting part. For different groups, you expect covariates to have different effects. And this requires some handwork, because what I had to do here at the end was basically do unequal t-tests between units that ended up in each leaf and compare the conditional average treatment effects between each leaf. And it's not something that the packages do automatically. It's something that I had to do afterwards. It was a little bit annoying, but it's fun. So basically, this is again for AR-15's effect on your preference to have that person as a neighbor. Everyone dislikes it, except one group, which is people who are 40 or older, have quite high gun desirability, and have one or fewer, or have 2 or fewer children. And that's the only group at this very narrow level of a policy tree that can be easily identified as having a positive outcome from this treatment on their preference to have that person as a neighbor. I'm selecting covariates here that are based on the participant characteristics, not based on any of the neighbor characteristics. Okay. Yes. We don't have time for this. You can do t-tests where you compare participants who do or do not meet some salient cutoff point. For me, I chose greater than 0 predicted conditional average treatment effect. So like, does this person prefer a neighbor, or is predicted to prefer a neighbor who has an AR-15 over a neighbor who does not have an AR-15? I chose that as this very salient binary. And then I just looked at every participant's characteristics and their predicted conditional average treatment effects, and I did t-tests between them. And I found some salient participant level characteristics and salient neighbor profile characteristics, which both confirmed and conflicted with existing theoretical literature on what drives people to be comfortable with gun ownership. Things I think that are really interesting about this are the no association. Things that were predicted, like education, income, and criminal victimization, had nothing to do with people's comfort with a neighbor who had an AR-15, but were seen in the literature as likely to be salient. So I think that was sort of interesting. All right. Let's see if we have enough time for this. I don't know. We'll try it. Here, I want you to think about what this effect will have on people's desire for guns. Now, this is a treatment, and the outcome is average desire for guns.
There are 3 types of people in this world: sheep, wolves, and sheepdogs. Now, some people prefer to believe that evil doesn't exist in the world, and that if ever darkened their doorstep, they wouldn't know how to protect themselves. Those are the sheep. And then you got predators. They use violence to prey on the weak. They're the wolves. And then there are those who've been blessed with the gift of aggression and the overpowering need to protect the flock. These men are the rare breed that live to confront the wolf. They are the sheepdog. And we're not raising any sheep in this family. And I will whoop your ass if you turn into a wolf. But we protect our own.
Oh no. That was not supposed to happen. Uh, this should work. Okay. So I have this really cool pull everywhere thing where y'all were gonna place your predictions on the internet and we were going to have time to discuss, but you had a bunch of really great questions that I decided to answer. So I'm gonna blame it on you rather than me. What? Oh no. Okay. I broke it. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. That's green. Yes.
I don't.
Okay, but hold some honest opinion about what that has an effect. And think about like, okay, it's a short video, it's probably not gonna have a huge effect. You know, it's just a little like an advertisement doesn't usually affect anything in particular, despite what Super Bowl might think. Okay. All right. Here's density function of the actual effects. And this is confirmed by OLS regression. Same answer as you'd expect from a randomized experiment, you know. This has a negative effect, people's desire to own a gun, and that's completely counter to the theory that I, you know, live, breathe, and swim in. But it then leaves an important question, which, what about these people? This is the analysis that I'm currently engaged in and is half-baked at this point. So I think a frequent thing that we've encountered or hope to encounter one day, if you haven't encountered already, is a result that goes against existing theory and you're not quite sure what's going on. What I'm suggesting, and I'll try and conclude very briefly, is that this is a great opportunity to try and discover heterogeneity as a possible cause of unexpected effects. If it isn't just like you're completely wrong for all units, maybe there's some interesting theoretical insight you could give to which units experience treatments differently.
So you were expecting this to push everyone towards wanting guns more?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that was something that isn't the point of this talk, but most of the literature I deal with talks about a combination of masculinity, whiteness, middle class.
Okay, so these are the
values.
people they're representing sort of the people in that slide you showed of
Yeah,
who is okay with neighbors' guns.
yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And here's my ongoing analysis, which is not very pretty, of what drives heterogeneity in this group. And each group has predicted positive conditional adverse treatment effect or predicted negative conditional adverse treatment effect for that video on their desire for guns. And so what we find is that people who own guns look at that video and say, hey, that confirms I have an increased desire for guns. People with political view where higher is more conservative, more Republican, predicted conditional adverse treatment effect as you'd expect. But it's also conditioned by different levels of income. If you have higher levels of income and you're younger, this is the group for whom this conditions. So this is an area where it's like, I don't know There's a bunch of conflicting theory, and I'm now in the process of analyzing this and bringing to bear my domain expertise to try and interpret how does this conflict with literature and how does this add to the literature.
Just, sorry, you lost me somewhere.
Yeah,
You showed that video to a bunch of people and you
Oh,
asked,
yes.
sorry, and you
I
asked
showed a
them,
video to 2,109. Yeah,
what was the question you asked them? Did you ask them, does the person in the video own a gun, or would that, what was the,
the question I asked them was, take a look at this picture of a gun,
uh-huh.
use this
Where was the
slider
gun?
to indicate your desire for this gun from all the way left to all the way right. Most desire to no desire.
Based on that video? My desire for a gun based on the,
It wasn't, no, I didn't ask them based on it. I just asked them immediately after.
So it's kind of like a priming thing.
It's a vignette,
Okay.
study. Yeah,
so I watched the video and then what's my desire for a gun?
precisely.
Did you ask them my desire for a gun before?
No, but I had control videos, where they watched a brief excerpt of football and, to play. And a bunch of other
Yeah.
videos where they watch different things, different theorized desires.
Okay, thank you. That
Crime
helps with the
videos,
context
other
there. Sorry.
videos too. Yeah, I'm
It's okay.
breaking into your question.
It's okay. I just wanted to understand what this was referring to.
All right. Yeah, this is a good question, and if I had more time, I'd explain it. So, as I was alluding to earlier, my argument is that these developing methods, while they're still in their infancy in terms of interpretability, offer very strong opportunities to help us deal with unexpected things, which are a gift. Because if we don't encounter anything unexpected, I would argue the research was at best like a replication, right? This helps us complete the research cycle and adhere more towards an ideal that we can never reach, but drives the discipline forward. And, all right, where am I looking to go from here? There's also an argument, which I don't write down, but like I think is considering our political situation, that you can use this type of machine learning to find discrimination and find aspects of the social world that we expect to be true without pre-specifying the nature of those relationships. And by not pre-specifying the nature of those relationships, you can find them just as well as you can do currently. And that allows you some flexibility in how you talk about a research project. I might want to sell too hard, but I think that's a cool possibility that these techniques give you, given that you collect the important covariates in the first place. So there are a couple of open questions. Interpretation is still a work in progress. Meta-regression, I think, is the cutting edge for this, where you do a causal forest, you use that to inform either subsequent causal forests that focus on like lasso selected variables, or subsequent like OLS regressions and subsequent steps. So this is not oh, you do a causal forest and you have true insight into all causal heterogeneity. This is you do a causal forest and then you have a bunch of things to interpret. And I'm looking forward to a bunch more work on this. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Really enjoyed the talk. This just gets back to Guang's question about heterogeneity. I think they're two different, using different definitions. So like typically like with aggression approach, you think of unobserved heterogeneity would be unobserved confounder. So it'd be a variable that theoretically should be in like, and I guess part of the idea here is to get back to maybe the primacy of theory. It'd be an unobserved variable that's actually theoretically important. So like imagine just a simple example, you're trying to find the effect of education on wages. So you regress wages on education, but you don't have ambition in the model. Should be. Ambition increases education and increases wages. You don't have it. The question would be, if you run it through, some sort of causal forest, you'll wind up with all sorts of like interactions, perhaps on the observed variables, when it's actually perhaps driven by, and very simply by an unobserved confounder. So some people will have a higher effective education or a lower effective education. It looks like effect heterogeneity, when really it's just the missing confounder driving, making the results look more complicated.
I absolutely agree. if you don't measure the variables to consider in the causal forest, you're not going to be able to use them to derive important theoretical conclusions. Because, but on the other hand, there are some cool. Okay, so like there's a paper by Nye and Wager about the residualization process that says that if at least one of the propensity to treatment and the underlying like condition, like expectation of outcome based on covariates, at least one of those two residualization steps is correctly specified, the other can be largely misspecified, and your estimates, not your theoretical interpretation, but the estimates produced for conditional average treatment effects for the causal forest will still be consistent. So your point remains 100%, and I don't know of a way to escape it, but there is a benefit that you can misspecify at least one aspect of the functional form.
Maybe it would be like, because on one hand, the argument that you were making was we should, run the causal force before we theorize. But if the underlying theorization helps you think about what might be a missing unobserved confounder, might be necessary in order to anticipate how the model might fail.
I think there's a missing first step, which is like in the research cycle, going a little earlier. This step here, I'm talking about step 3, but if there's a problem with going from step 1 to step 2, where you don't measure ambition, but you think based on theory that it should have an effect, that's going to limit you. And I think that you need to think hard about the data as you process the data and prepare it for any type of statistical analysis. I know that sounds very generic, but I think that you're right, but it's sort of, my intervention is operating at a different stage in the research circle.
Yeah, this is a related question. It seems like the concern about maybe unobserved confounding or unobserved heterogeneity is most important for the treatment assignment step. And in the examples you showed, the treatment assignment is random, so maybe that's less of a concern. But when using this with observational data, it seems like it relies still on the sort of conditional on the covariates. The treatment assignment is random, which is a pretty strong assumption. So I guess maybe in my perspective, the main competitor would be like a quasi-experimental design where you have some plausible exogenous source of variation, where you don't rely on observational treatment assignment or treatment assignment only, depending on observed variables. So I guess how strong, it seems like it relies strongly on that assumption, but I don't know if you have additional insight.
It relies strongly on estimating that assumption. So it doesn't, kind of the opposite. Your first initial step, which I deliberately ignored, but is discussed in the handout, is a residualization of the expectation of treatment conditional on all covariates. So that residualization is there precisely to discover the relationship of the treatment, which is completely underlying exactly that point. So yeah, that's an important first step. And I managed to avoid it in random experiments because I know the propensity. But otherwise, there would be a initial forest that determines the relationship or tries to determine heterogeneity in the relationship of assignment to treatment for observational data, or where there is no, instrument.
And I guess I wonder if another future step would be either bringing in an instrument in that first stage, or maybe timing based treatment assignment, or a more explicit control group, something like that, instead of just the covariate based treatment assignment. I don't know if anyone's doing that.
So there's the GRF package includes a bunch of different techniques. The regression forest is a technique that will assess treatment propensity based on covariates, but not including propensity to treatment. It's like W conditioned on X. But then the causal forest is a special subsequent forest based on the idea of an instrumental forest, which starts with a regression forest. And then once it has the initial regression forest that predicts W, the expectation of W conditioned on X, and the expectation of outcome Y conditioned on X, both. After that adjustment, then does a forest on the residualization. So your head is exactly in the right place, and that's the innovation of the causal forest, is that it's trying to approach this ideal perfect matching. And it's sort of the closest thing is it essentially creates like an adaptive kernel to approach those units that are most similar and weight the conditional after treatment effects on those units that are most similar after adjustment for propensity to treatment. But like that's exactly the concern that drives the causal forest. Yeah.
All right, we're at 1 o'clock. Thank you very much.